Today I have a bit of a special video as we come up to Mother's Day. This is the second portrait of a subject that you've already seen in my video on creating monochromatic paintings. But since this was the second portrait of this particular subject, I was asked to introduce some color to set it apart from the previous piece. Trouble was that this was from a black and white photo, just like the original photo that I used for the previous video. So I didn't have enough information to paint it in full color. Now, as I mentioned in that first video on monochromatic paintings, Richard Schmid tended to use multiple pigments for monochrome pieces to provide slight temperature variations. Despite what the monochromatic label would suggest, these pieces actually did read as being a single tone, but these subtle variations really helped take the pieces to the next level, and I thought I might be able to run with that. So my thought here was that I could potentially take this one step further. Now, I wouldn't try to render the portrait in full color, but I think introducing a broader range of color temperature could be a great middle ground. One factor here came from a special request to include blue in this piece, as this was our sitter's favorite color. I could have gone cool toned for the whole piece to keep the color temperature range pretty compressed, and just base it on ultramarine blue, but I thought this might feel a bit too cold, so doing a warm toned piece with some blue elements was what I decided on. So I start this piece as I did my first portrait. I begin with a wash of my dominant color. This is the one the color harmony is based around. In this piece, this was ultimately a combination of Terra Rosa along with the transparent oxide colors, but I believe for the underpainting, I stuck with just the transparent oxides, some yellow, some red, some brown, and then I came back in with a little bit of Viridian to desaturate those colors. And now later you're going to see me reintroduce Terra Rosa and Yellow Ochre, the more opaque earth tones. And you're also going to see me introduce some ultramarine to bring that blue in that we want. But for the very beginning, I wanted to really just stick to the transparent oxides because they have the jewel-like glow that no other pigment has when they're transparent. As we build up the paint and in turn gain more opacity, this is where I start to look to the other colors instead. But for areas that I know are going to be transparent, I want to pick pigments that are really going to stand out. To that end, pretty quickly, I begin to experiment with a couple of colors for her face. At first, I have something that pulls a little bit more yellow, but I wanted to find something a bit richer in color, so I introduced some Terra Rosa and Permanent Magenta into the mix. This was a little bit tricky because my photo was maybe, I wouldn't say overexposed, but it definitely washed out the value of most of her face, such that it almost looked white in the photo itself. I knew that I didn't want to go too light, or else I wouldn't be able to show the richness of her skin tone, but going too much darker felt kind of strange. So right away, you see me going back and forth a bit between these two extremes until I feel like I found a shade that feels true to both the photograph as well as what it would have looked like in person. You're going to really see me jump into this process here in just a moment. But up until this point, I've really just been focused on the block in. So, really making sure that the placement of the facial features seemed correct and that I'm beginning to chisel out a likeness. I don't want to get too much detail at this point, but as long as I am making progress toward the ultimate vision and I'm not wasting energy here, that's really what's top of mind at this point. And now you really see me begin to experiment with those different tones and those different values. In my previous two pieces on tonal or monochromatic paintings, I mentioned that it's almost impossible to invent realistic color for these sorts of images. Light and all the colors that it produces are simply too complex to invent rather than observe if you want to capture all of its nuance. But when you remove chroma and saturation, these other two components of light beyond just the light or dark, things get much simpler. It's easier to invent with a fair degree of realism when you're only focusing on value. That is to say, focusing on how light or dark the shapes of your painting are. This means that I feel pretty comfortable pushing the values and experimenting to find what strikes the right balance, whereas the color component of this would feel overwhelming, and it's pretty unlikely that I would arrive at something that felt authentic. So here you see me wiping away first with a brush and then a little bit with a paper towel to see if I can find that optimal level. I don't want to go too light, which is going to feel faithful to the photo, but still kind of weird when you take it out of the context of an image that you trust. One thing that I find with painting is even if it is like 99% faithful to a photograph, it gets a lot more scrutiny than something that we trust as being real, like a photo. This means kind of visual quirks or distortions that you might see in a photograph. If you actually carry those over into a painting, chances are people are going to notice it in a way that they wouldn't have in the photo. So I have to begin to make decisions along these lines. If I think something looks visually ambiguous or confusing, it doesn't matter if it was that way in the photo. I, as a painter, have to do some problem solving to figure out what that ambiguity is coming from and how I can resolve it so that visually this feels believable and you aren't distracted into looking at tiny quirks of the painting rather than appreciating the whole of the image that's in front of you. The next major thing you see happen in this piece is that I go ahead and really focus on refining all of the shapes until they become smaller and smaller, and the likeness begins to feel like it's reached this critical mass. I'm no longer working on a drawing, so to speak. I'm working on almost more of a memory. The core of the piece becomes the person, not the marks that I'm putting down as an artist. Once I get to this kind of magical point, it becomes so much easier to make these corrections that help really take the likeness to the next level. There are these pieces of the composition that I can kind of go to as anchors, these places that I know are correct. I know that the mark was in the right place, that it's the right size, that it's the right shape, and I can base other measurements off of that, other proportions. It really becomes so much easier once you have these areas that can ground you. Until then, when you're kind of questioning every part of the painting, which might not be a stage that all painting processes necessitate. That is, some painters measure everything. They don't kind of put in a gesture and then start checking, which is more or less how I work. So, because I begin with this gesture, there is a stage toward the beginning where I'm not 100% confident in anything. I have kind of this general idea and I'm trying to bring that into focus slowly, but there's no single component that I know for a fact is accurate. I tend to really enjoy this part, oddly enough, but at the same time, it's really easy to feel lost here. Um, I've used this metaphor about feeling grounded several times now, and that's really the best way that I can think to describe it. Hitting the critical mass on the likeness, though, it means almost all of these facial features act as their own little anchors. You are really confident in so many aspects of each of the marks that make up these features that you have a whole lot of context for making any corrections or improvements. As a side note, I hope you enjoy my cat Boomer's contribution to this video. I do not know what she wanted because she has food and she has gotten many attentions today. I think she just wanted you all to know that she was there and that she was feeling left out. So now she has been included. Anyway, getting back to the painting, as I watched through the playback, that's really kind of the zone that I'm at this point. The only problem is that I made one critical error. So I am continuing over probably the next minute to get this piece closer and closer to my reference. Only problem is that my reference turned out not to be as accurate as I thought. So I made one critical mistake here. Because I was working from a photograph I didn't take, I actually had to use a photo of a photo. That is, my reference predated digital photography, so I couldn't just have someone send me a file to paint from, which is how I would typically work if for whatever reason I couldn't take a photograph myself. So, because there wasn't a digital file that could simply be duplicated to my computer, I had to have some way to get that physical photograph over to my studio. And seeing as this was a really special photo, we thought the best solution here would simply be to go ahead and take a photo of it and then, with a camera phone, and then send that over. Now, my mistake here was not checking the measurements of that photo and instead assuming that it was a standard size that I inadvertently forced the photo into. The result was that I stretched the whole photo too wide so that while the painting was accurate to my reference, it was not accurate to the original photograph or my subject. This isn't super visible from the angle that you are viewing this time lapse at because you're seeing it kind of compressed from the side. But this was actually pretty dramatic when you were looking at the photograph dead on. So, as a painter, the next thing that had to happen was that I had to make a decision about how to proceed. Like with any of the other tonal pieces that I've shared and talked about here, I couldn't simply correct the error by adding more paint. I needed to rely on solvents to erase out work that I had already done and hope that I could get back to the white of the canvas successfully. And more importantly, I didn't want to waste the tricky rendering of the areas like her eyes, which were easily the hardest and most time consuming piece of the painting that I had invested so much energy into already. My solution was first, to get a new reproduction of the photo that I could verify was completely accurate. So I got measurements of the original photo that I could then use to double check that my image was 100% correct. Almost always, when you take an image of a 2D object, whether it's a photograph or a painting, it's taken at a very slight angle, and you have to do some correcting in Photoshop. So you have to transform it and make these corrections to a certain extent to remove any parallax or skewing that occurred. So after I made those corrections on my new reference, I could then compare those to the measurements that were taken. And then after I finished all the transformations, I could then send those back to the client and make sure that those compared perfectly with the photo that we're working from. This was exceptionally helpful. Since most of the time I'm taking my own photos, this really hadn't been an issue that I had encountered before. In previous pieces where I couldn't take the photo myself, I had access to the physical photo that I was copying, so I could do all of those things without even really thinking twice about it. Now, whenever I'm working from a client's photo, I am definitely going to make sure to ask that they measure it beforehand. Because what this piece demonstrated to me is that I absolutely should not go on instinct or an assumption about a photograph having any kind of standard size. So, in your own work, if you're ever working from a photo that you aren't going to physically keep in front of you, if it's not a digital file, I would highly recommend that you do the same. And also, totally scrutinize the angle that photos were taken at. So often, I see people working from images of photos that are taken with a great deal of perspective on them, which distorts the entire image. Similarly, the opposite is true. Maybe you have a perfect reference, but you're working on an easel or a drawing board that's tilted away from you. The result of this is that once you actually straighten it back up so that it's parallel to your face, you realize that the entire thing has been stretched. And I get why we do it. You know, we tilt easels back because that's kind of how we see them, and we use drawing boards at an angle because that's what's comfortable. A lot of the times when we're working on a drawing, we want to just kind of keep it in our lap rather than having to like stand up to an easel. Because if you keep it in your lap, you can be sketching while you're like watching TV or like chatting with people. But if you're putting it on an easel that's totally upright, suddenly you're not multitasking anymore. You're in this very serious business of making a drawing, and that's not always the mindset that we just naturally want to be in when we work. It can be a kind of annoying shift at first to start adopting all of these habits that help us create better paintings, like making sure we set up our easel in a certain way, or we set up our panel in a certain way, or we make sure that our still life is 100% the way we want it before we start painting, or that we actually compose the image exactly how we want it. So, these are little things that feel like we have a lot of inertia to overcome when we first want to start changing these habits. But once you kind of get over the hill and these are just normal for you, little steps like double checking your reference and making 100% sure that your reference is 100% faithful to the subject, um, it makes a really big difference, and you stop noticing the extra effort that it requires to double check that you're going to have a piece that you're really happy with and that your client is really happy with. Now, okay, that was a mouthful. Um, After that step of getting a new reference that was totally accurate, once that was out of the way, the next thing was to make sure that I didn't have to retread any ground unnecessarily. I had already spent so many time on the eyes, as I had already mentioned, so I actually decided to use the eyes as an anchor point. So I overlaid my new corrected reference on top of the old one, syncing up their eyes, and then from there, noting any differences that radiated out from that point. Thankfully, this actually wasn't too hard. Most changes came down to the left side of her face, from our perspective, which wasn't a complicated area to repaint. I simply created a new edge on that left hand side and erased out any of the previous flesh tone that was there, and put in more of that ultramarine background. Some other changes that you can see me make here are um, to go ahead and darken up her hair so that it appeared more black. I think in a normal tonal piece, you can kind of get away with a really compressed value range. So painting something that might be black in real life as kind of a mid-tone brown or brick red. But when you start to expand out like I have here to introduce more colors and more temperatures, it started to feel a little strange that her hair wasn't as dark as it would have been in real life. The rest of the adjustments, and there were a few to her nose, mouth, and um, some continued tweaking that I did to her right eye from our perspective. Um, these were pretty minor, all in all. They just took kind of a disproportionate amount of time because these areas are so key as far as capturing a likeness. There was just simply more going on there than there would be at, say, the edge of her face or, even something like her hair, which I can get away with introducing more abstraction to. Another thing that made this a little bit trickier is that in a lot of these places I had already built up quite a bit of paint, and I had to be really careful about removing it. When introducing a solvent like Gamsol, which is somewhat slow evaporating, or even something like acetone, which evaporates very quickly, regardless, something that can happen is that your solvent drips into other parts of the painting, and suddenly you've disturbed something that didn't need fixing, and suddenly you have to fix the thing that shouldn't have needed fixing to begin with. So, I'm actually introducing a couple of techniques here that I hadn't used on paintings before this. So, I actually got out an X-Acto blade, and I relied on that as well as a smaller palette knife to try and scrape off as much of that paint as possible before going in with the solvent. This was a pretty slow process, but I will say I definitely liked bringing these into the workflow. So if you're working on tonal pieces of your own, if you need to erase something and the painting has been sitting for long enough that Gamsol alone can't really tackle the problem, um, rather than just going straight for something like acetone and really scrubbing that in there, I would definitely start with a palette knife and see how much you can just carefully pry off or lift off with that, and then use the acetone to remove any residue that's left behind. The X-Acto blade was a little bit interesting. I'm somewhat used to using a palette knife, but I've never used an X-Acto blade on like a painting in progress before. And what I found was that mine was too sharp. Not in that it caused damage or anything, but the point was so fine that it was too small to really make an impact anywhere that I needed it. So I think in the future, I would probably go through other blades that I have, either from a paint scraper or a different X-Acto blade that I use in the studio, and try and use something that had really been like beaten down to more of a blunt point. I think the X-Acto knife could be pretty helpful. Um, I think that process will just take a little bit of tweaking before I find the exact right application for it. Now, my final adjustment here is one more look at the silhouette. So that left hand profile of her face. So I'm lifting out just a little more paint one last time and then going back in with the ultramarine, trying as best as I could not to let the either the original edge of her face show, um, or let the erasure mark from removing it show. That can be somewhat tricky, and a lot of the times, especially in drawing, I think more than painting, what can happen when we are trying to remove either a really hard edge or a line from a piece that needs correcting, is that in erasing it, we actually reinforce it. So, one technique that can be used here that I use to a certain extent is to actually erase out much more than you need, go in a much broader area, and then when you go back and fill, it's going to feel less like a series of lines all next to one another from where you were erasing out the original mark. And that was the last correction on this piece, and we are ready to varnish. As always, I am using Gamvar gloss here. The great thing about Gamvar is that it can go on much more quickly than other varnishes. And the great thing about these tonal pieces that really don't have any paint buildup and instead are very thinned down with solvent is that they dry extremely quickly. This piece was ready to go, I think, 48 hours after that last correction was made. Now, my test to make sure that it's safe to varnish is to first kind of like pat my fingertips on the piece and see if any paint lifts off. Now, generally, I'm already very confident that the piece is dry before I attempt this. So I don't think I've ever actually just put my fingerprints into a painting before. This usually comes back totally clean. The next step might be to like lightly drag my fingers across. And actually, in this piece, what I found is that I think I checked the piece at 24 hours, and I found just a little bit of residue from the ultramarine. I couldn't even see which part of the painting it had come off of, but I definitely didn't want there to be any way that that could interact with the varnish. So I did give it one more day, and then at that time, the painting totally came back clean. You know, I could touch the entire thing without anything coming back onto my hands. And since there were no areas of thicker paint, I was good to go at that point. And as I apply this, you'll see that I'm actually picking up the painting and letting the light hit it from various angles. That's just one final check to make sure that the piece is entirely covered in varnish, which I find extremely helpful. Thankfully, this small piece was very easy to cover. I had a very easy time varnishing it, and after 24 hours, it was ready for delivery and is now in my client's home, where I hope she can very much enjoy this in time for Mother's Day. If you have your own piece that you are working on for Mother's Day, or a piece you would like made for Mother's Day, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what you're working on or what you might like my help with. As always, if you liked this video or found it helpful, I hope you will give this a video a like so that others can find it as well. And to be totally in the loop as far as anytime new videos come out, please go ahead and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the notification bell so that you know anytime I have a live stream or just when a new video comes out. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. I hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. And until my next video, happy painting.